The music had stopped. 500 guests, senators, admirals, tech moguls, had gone dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses, a sudden, suffocating quiet that fell over the room. And walking down the center aisle, arm in arm with me, was General Hale, a 4-star legend known to the world as the architect of the Pacific. He didn't look at the groom. He didn't look at the bride. He marched me straight to the head table, his dress shoes clicking against the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown, and stopped directly in front of my father. My father, Colonel Richard Sterling, a man who believed his own bloodline, was a disappointment, stood up, his face draining of color. The champagne glass in his hand trembled, spilling a single drop onto the tablecloth. He raised his hand to salute the general, snapping to attention out of instinct, but Hale didn't salute back. He just stood there, waiting. He was waiting for the colonel to salute me. My father spent 30 years worshipping the chain of command. He breathed it. He lived it. But he never imagined that one day, the chain of command would end with his disappointment of a daughter. To understand how I stole the bride's thunder without saying a single word, we have to go back to the rehearsal dinner. It was 24 hours earlier, inside a banquet hall that smelled of expensive lilies and old money. I was where I always was at these events, table 19. The overflow table. The one right next to the kitchen swinging doors, where the waiters dumped their trays and the draft was cold enough to make you shiver. I sat there picking at a cold roll, watching my family hold court at the head table like royalty. My brother, Mark, the family's golden boy who wore his charisma like a shield, was beaming in his dress whites. He had just made lieutenant, and to my parents, that was the only achievement that mattered. I wasn't jealous of Mark, I loved him, but I was exhausted by the performance. Then came the speeches. My father stood up, tapping his spoon against a champagne flute, the sound piercing the low hum of conversation. He launched into a 10-minute monologue about duty, honor, and legacy. He pointed to Mark, beaming with a pride he never bothered to hide. "My son, the lieutenant," he boomed, his voice thick with scotch and self-importance. Continuing the Sterling tradition of service. A real soldier. Then, his eyes glazed over as they drifted to the back of the room, landing on me near the kitchen doors. He smirked, a sloppy, dismissive expression I knew too well. And, Sarah works with computers. The room chuckled. He wasn't done. Probably fixing printers or resetting passwords, right, sweetie? The laughter rippled through the hall, polite, dismissive, stinging. It was the same laugh from when I missed prom to study for the Foreign Service exam, the same chuckle from when I told them I got a job in logistics. To him, I was just IT support, a civilian, a footnote in his biography. I gripped the tablecloth, forcing a tight plastic smile as the shame washed over me. He thought I fixed printers. He didn't know that just 6 hours ago, I had used those computers to authorize a drone strike that kept this entire wedding reception from becoming a target. In the Sterling household, respect was a finite resource, and it was allocated strictly by rank. My father, a man whose entire personality was folded neatly into a retired colonel's uniform, believed that if you didn't wear camouflage to work, you weren't actually working. To him, service meant polished boots, shouting orders, and a chest full of ribbons, not sitting in a windowless room analyzing signal intercepts. Because I was a civilian contractor, a suit, I was invisible to him. I wasn't a soldier, I was just overhead. He looked at me and saw a lack of discipline, a lack of drive, and worst of all, a lack of relevance. It started as a simple misunderstanding about my job title, but over the years it calcified into a joke I couldn't escape. They called me IT support. At Thanksgiving, while my brother Mark told stories about basic training that everyone had heard a dozen times, my mother would loudly interrupt to ask if I could fix the Wi-Fi because Sarah works with computers. I stopped correcting them 5 years ago. I just fixed the router, smiled a tight, painful smile, and swallowed the truth. I didn't tell them that the computers I worked with tracked ballistic missile submarines. I didn't tell them that my clearance level was higher than my father's ever was, even at the peak of his career. My reality was a world of cold air and red warning lights inside a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It's a room suspended in magnetic silence, where phones are banned, and the only currency is information. While my family was posting photos of their vacations on Facebook, I was usually staring at, 3 monitors, watching heat signatures move across a grainy satellite feed in real time. I lived in the shadows of the data stream, hunting for the anomalies that everyone else missed. It was lonely work, quiet work, but it was the only place where I felt powerful. In that room, I wasn't the disappointing daughter. I was a senior threat analyst, and my word could redirect fleets. Sitting there at the rehearsal dinner, watching my father scream at a terrified waiter about a $15 corkage fee, the absurdity of my double life almost made me laugh out loud. He was turning purple over a bottle of Cabernet, acting like the fate of the free world hinged on a receipt. It was pathetic. My mind drifted back to a room much quieter than this banquet hall, but infinitely more dangerous. It was the day I met General Hale properly, not as a fan, but as an obstacle. It was a joint intelligence briefing at the Pentagon, the kind of room where the air is thin and careers go to die. A room full of stars and eagles. They were ready to greenlight an extraction mission based on human intelligence that looked solid on paper. I was the only one in the room who saw the trap. I stood up, a 26-year-old analyst in a thrift store blazer, and interrupted a room full of seasoned commanders. My hands were shaking under the table, but my voice was steady. I told them their intel was compromised. I told them if they launched, they were walking into a kill box. Most of the officers scoffed, dismissing me just like my father would have. But General Hale, the man currently sitting at the head table of this wedding, didn't scoff. He looked at me with eyes that felt like they were drilling for oil. He asked for my call sign. Oracle, I said. He asked for the raw data. I gave it to him. He canceled the mission on my word alone, overriding his own staff. 2 days later, we confirmed the ambush. That was the beginning of Operation Black Fog, a counterintelligence sweep that saved 36 operatives and incidentally saved Hale's career from a catastrophic failure. Since then, I wasn't just an employee, I was his seeing eye dog in the digital fog. He didn't make a strategic move in the Pacific Theater without checking if Oracle had signed off on the variables. To him, I was a vital asset, a weapon of unmatched precision. To the man currently chewing out a waiter over corkage fees, I was just the girl who couldn't get a real job. I looked at my father, seeing the veins bulging in his neck, and I tallied the cost of his ignorance. I saw the piano recitals he skipped because work came first. I saw the way he looked right through me at graduation to wave at a recruiter, and I saw the irony burning bright and hot. He worshipped power, yet he was treating the most powerful asset in his bloodline like hired help. He loved the idea of protection, but he had no idea who was actually holding the shield. I had spent a decade protecting my country in the dark so my family could play dress up in the light. I was content to stay in the shadows, until General Hale walked into the reception. When the double doors swung open, the atmosphere in the banquet hall didn't just change, it pressurized. General Hale stepped inside, looking less like a wedding guest and more like he was inspecting a perimeter. To the civilians, he was a celebrity, but to the military men in the room, he was a god. I watched my father stiffen, his posture snapping into a rigid vertical line. He immediately abandoned his conversation, smoothing his jacket with frantic energy, preparing to force a handshake that he would talk about for the next 10 years. He began to cut through the crowd, eyes locked on the prize, ready to bask in the reflected glory of a superior officer. I instinctively sought cover. I slid my chair back behind a massive floral-draped pillar, trying to merge with the dry wall. It wasn't just shame, though sitting at a table wobbly enough to spill my water. Every time someone bumped it didn't help. It was operational security. My worlds were never supposed to touch. If Hale acknowledged me here, in the civilian failure box my family had built for me, it would shatter the delicate silence I lived in. I held my breath, counting the seconds, praying he would just look at the bride. But General Hale didn't get 4 stars by missing the anomaly in the room. His gaze swept the hall with terrifying precision, bypassing the groom, ignoring the bride's father, and sliding right over my father's desperate outstretched hand. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He marched straight past the caviar station, past the open bar, and into the dimly lit exile of the overflow section. My father was left standing in the middle of the dance floor, his hand gripping empty air, a look of utter confusion cracking his composure. Hale stopped directly in front of me. The silence at my table was deafening. He looked down at the half-empty juice boxes and the discarded crayons scattered around my plate, and his jaw tightened. It was a look I knew well, the cold, quiet fury of a commander seeing a soldier left behind. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that only I could hear. "Oracle," he said, using the name that commanded fleets. "Eyes on me. This seating chart is a hostile environment. We're going to execute a field promotion." He offered his arm, his expression daring anyone to challenge him. "Stick with me and play along as my date. That's an order." I stared at his elbow. He wasn't asking for a dance. He was offering me a weapon. By taking his arm, I wouldn't just be moving tables. I would be borrowing the weight of the entire U.S. military to crush the narrative that I was nothing. I took his arm. In that moment, I wasn't Sarah the disappointing daughter. I was Oracle. And we were about to walk into the lion's den. We moved through the banquet hall like a breaking wave, the murmur of conversation dying out instantly as we passed each table. Walking arm in arm with General Hale wasn't just a social cue, it was a procession. I could feel the eyes of every officer in the room burning into us, curiosity mixed, with a sudden, sharp reevaluation of who, exactly, was sitting at table 19. But my father didn't see our reevaluation, he saw a crisis. To him, I was still the clumsy civilian daughter who didn't belong, the it girl, who was currently pestering a 4-star general and embarrassing the family name. He scrambled away from the head table, abandoning his drink, and intercepted us just before we reached the dais. He looked frantic, his face flushed with the desperate need to manage the situation. "General Hale, please, I am so incredibly sorry," my father stammered, breathless, stepping directly into our path. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed pleadingly on Hale, terrified that I had already ruined his chance at networking. "My daughter has absolutely no sense of protocol. She doesn't understand that men of your stature shouldn't be bothered by civilian chatter." He reached out, his fingers brushing my elbow, trying to subtly, or perhaps not, so subtly, pull me away, back to the shadows where he believed I belonged. "Sarah, go back to your seat. Now." General Hale stopped moving. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head slowly, looking at my father with a gaze so cold it could have frozen a reactor core. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hale didn't look at my father's outstretched hand. He looked at the ribbons on my father's chest, then up to his eyes, stripping away his rank with a single glance. "Colonel," Hale said, the word sounding less like a title and more like a reprimand. "If you knew half of what this woman does for this country, you wouldn't be trying to send her away. You'd be standing at attention." My father recoiled as if he'd been slapped. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Before he could recover, Hale stepped past him, leading me directly to the center of the head table. He didn't sit down. Instead, he reached for the microphone that had been used for the polite, hollow toasts earlier in the evening. The feedback whine cut through the room, silencing the last few whispers. Hale scanned the crowd, my brother, the groom, looking terrified, the senators, the admirals. He ignored them all. "We talk a lot about service in this room," Hale began, his voice booming without effort. "We pin medals on chests. We have parades. We love the noise of it." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "But the wars of this century aren't won on parade grounds. They are won in the dark, by silent warriors who never get a round of applause." He gestured vaguely to the room, but his eyes were locked on me. "Last month, during the tense standoff in the South China Sea, the one you all read about in the papers, we were minutes away from a catastrophic engagement. Intelligence was conflicted. My own staff was blind. I saw my brother shift in his seat. He knew the story. He had bragged about how his guys were ready to deploy. We didn't deploy," Hale continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that forced everyone to lean in. "Because one analyst, a single mind in a sea of noise, saw what we missed. She made a call that saved 2,000 American lives and prevented a global conflict. She saved my career." The room was motionless. My father was staring at Hale, a dawn of horrific realization creeping into his eyes. Hale turned to me, raising his champagne glass high. "Gentlemen," Hale said, delivering the final blow. I don't make a move in the Pacific Theater unless this woman signs off on it first. To Oracle. The smartest operator in the room? The toast wasn't polite, it was an order. The entire room raised their glasses in unison, turning to look at me. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my father. He stood frozen near the cake table, his face pale, stripped of all his bluster. The IT support narrative hadn't just been challenged, it had been vaporized by the highest authority he recognized. I saw him struggle to process the math, the realization that the daughter he mocked for fixing printers held a clearance that made his own career look like a hobby. My father opened his mouth to speak, to assert some kind of dominance, but the general cut him a look that said, dismissed. The reception didn't stop after the general's toast, but the world inside that banquet hall had fundamentally realigned. It was as if gravity itself had shifted, pulling the room's center of mass away from the bridal table and directly toward me. The music started up again, a polite jazz quartet playing something soft, but nobody was dancing. Instead, a line began to form. Senators who had looked right through me during the cocktail hour were suddenly eager to introduce themselves, their handshakes firm and their eyes searching mine for some spark of the Oracle legend. An admiral leaned in to ask my thoughts on the emerging cyber threats in the Baltic, his tone hushed and respectful, treating me like a peer rather than a civilian curiosity. I answered him diplomatically, sidestepping the classified details with the practiced ease of someone who lives in the gray zones. But I couldn't help but notice the periphery. My father was standing just outside this new circle of influence, holding a fresh drink that he wasn't drinking. He looked like a man who had shown up to his own coronation only to find out he was the court jester. He tried to step in once, clearing his throat to interject with an anecdote about his time in the Gulf. But the admiral didn't even turn around. The wall of uniformed backs was impenetrable. My father, the man who commanded rooms by sheer volume for 30 years, was effectively boxed out by the silence of real authority. I watched him retreat to the bar, his smile tight and brittle, and I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even vindication. It was just the quiet, heavy realization that the pedestal I had spent my childhood trying to climb didn't actually exist. I endured another hour of congratulations, playing the part of the gracious guest, before the weight of the performance finally became too much. I signaled to General Hale that I was bugging out. He gave me a sharp nod, a dismissal that carried more warmth than any hug my father had ever given me, and I slipped out the side exit toward the valet stand. The night air was crisp, biting through the thin fabric of my dress, a welcome shock after the stifling heat of the ballroom. I just wanted to get to the extraction point, to the silence of a black SUV and the safety of my own life. But I heard the heavy, hurried footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. "Sarah, hold on a minute." I stopped, but I didn't turn around immediately. I took a breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, steeling myself. When I finally pivoted, my father was standing there under the harsh yellow glow of a street lamp. He looked smaller than he had inside. The crisp lines of his tuxedo seemed to sag, and for the first time I saw the age. In his face, the lines of a man who realized his legacy was leaving without him. But old habits die hard. He didn't look apologetic. He looked like he was trying to solve a tactical problem. He forced a chuckle, a dry, rasping sound that grated against the silence of the parking lot. "Quite a show in there," he said, gesturing vaguely back toward the hotel. Hale always did have a flair for the dramatic. "I didn't know you two were close." "We worked together, Dad," I said simply. "I told you that." Right. Work." He scuffed his dress shoe against the pavement, looking for an angle. Then he squared his shoulders, putting on the colonel mask one last time. "You know, Sarah, I was thinking about all this, the secrecy, the toughness. I suppose I should take a little credit. I was hard on you growing up. I pushed you. I made sure you didn't get soft." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to accept this rewritten history. "I knew you had to be tough to survive in a world like that. That's why I did it. That's why I was the way I was. I was preparing you." I stared at him, and the internal ledger I had carried for 20 years finally snapped shut. I thought about the science fair he skipped to go to Mark's football practice. I thought about the time I made the dean's list and he asked why I wasn't in ROTC. I thought about the IT support jokes, the snickers, the way he made me feel small so he could feel big. He wasn't preparing me for war, he was the war. I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that startled us both. You didn't push me, Dad, I said, my voice steady and low. You ignored me. You looked at me and saw nothing. So I went to a place where I could be something. I didn't become Oracle because of your lessons. I became her to survive your neglect. I took a step closer, ensuring he heard every syllable. I got there to spite you, not because of you. Do not confuse your absence with strategy. He stood there, mouth slightly open, the tough love narrative crumbling to dust in the night air. He had no orders to give, no rank to pull. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo standing in a parking lot. Before he could respond, the sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, the engine purring with quiet power. The general's driver, a hulking sergeant I knew well, stepped out and opened the rear door with a snap of professional courtesy. I didn't look back at my father. I didn't say goodbye. I just slid into the leather seat, the heavy door thudding shut and sealing me inside a world of silence and respect. As we pulled away, I watched through the tinted glass as my father walked slowly toward his rental sedan, a compact economy car that looked gray and small under the streetlights. That was the last time I saw him in person. I didn't cut them off completely. That would have required an emotional investment I no longer had. I sent Christmas cards. I sent a polite gift when Mark had his first kid. But I never went back for the holidays. I was promoted to section chief 6 months later, running operations that my father would only ever read about in redacted history books. I realized that family isn't about whose blood you carry, it's about who you'd bleed for. I found my family in the skiff, in the quiet nods of operators who knew the weight of what we carried. Rank isn't about the medal on your shoulder. It's about the weight you can carry when no one is watching. If you've ever been the most competent person in the room while being treated like the least, hit that like button. We see you.